We have so much news and headlines about Iran today, and it does affect people's economic lives a lot. I know you can't make a forecast, but what's the best estimate that your people have been able to come up with now for what this is going to do to inflation and how quickly?
Well, I think it will directly go into headline inflation because energy prices are an important component of that. So I expect headline inflation to actually be elevated, in the middle of this year. Of course, if energy prices come back down or stabilize, then that won't add more to inflation. So right now, my view on inflation is we're looking at an inflation rate for the year as a whole of something like 2.75%. But of course, it depends what happens with energy prices.
What could we get to in the meantime? What's the sort of thinking about where inflation on a numerical basis could end up?
Well, again, it's hard to predict that.
Estimate, not a forecast.
But clearly, we can get into above 3% inflation. I think markets' expectations right now are for CPI to be something like 3.25% over the next year. But it really depends on what happens, both in terms of how high do energy prices get, but also how long they stay high or whether they come back down. Personally, I'm also very focused on what's happening with underlying inflation, core inflation, inflation expectations, and other indicators as well, besides what's happening to energy prices, understanding the broader picture.
Well, what's happening with core inflation?
Yeah, so there, I think the story hasn't changed very much. Clearly, higher energy prices does add a little bit to core inflation. You think about airfares, which is part of core inflation, but it is influenced by fuel prices. So I expect that to add maybe a tenth or two to core inflation over the year, the energy price component. But we've seen tariff rates come down. We've seen some other, I think, more positive signs on underlying inflation. So overall, I'm kind of where I've been for a while with core inflation around 2.5% this year.
Well, how long, how high, how fast would inflation have to move to merit a rate response?
Well, I think really it does go back to kind of the full kind of set of factors influencing inflation. And I'm going to bring up tariffs because it is a big part of the story so far about why core inflation has been elevated. So I am watching, imported good prices, looking at core inflation expectations, and then obviously on top of that, what's happening to food and energy. So to my mind, monetary policy today is really well positioned, given where all of those dynamics have been playing out, and well positioned to kind of wait and see on some of the effects of what's happening today. This isn't. I'm not saying we're just in some kind of we can't act. I think this monetary policy is exactly where it needs to be, and then we can respond if the situation changes. Right now, I think that monetary policy though is pretty well positioned, given what we've been seeing so far.
Monetary policy is well positioned, but what about the economy? What's the state of the economy?
Yeah, well, if you asked me this a month or two ago, we would be talking about remarkable resilience of the economy, growing at 2% last year, looking to grow even faster this year. Clearly, with the conflict in the Middle East, that changes that a bit. Consumers, families are going to be paying higher fuel costs, gas price with the gas price increases. So I've been bringing down my forecast for growth this year, probably somewhere between 2 and 2.5% for growth this year. An unemployment rate probably staying around where it is now, 4.3%. And an economy that's continuing to grow, but roughly at trend. Again, driven by consumer spending and investments, especially in AI.
Well, you mentioned unemployment. You cut rates in the last year, we were told, basically to prop up the labor market. What is the state of the labor market? Is that accomplished?
Well, it's hard to read all the tea leaves because it's a pretty complicated situation with the labor market. We are seeing some various kind of different signals. My view is if you look at the unemployment rate, it's today at 4.3%. It's about where it was in July. So we've seen some stability there in terms of the unemployment rate and in job openings and some of the other indicators. So I feel like we've seen the labor market much more stable now. Definitely not a labor market that's weakening based on the economic indicators. That said, if you look at the surveys, including the survey that we do and the Conference Board survey, that's not how people are, kind of feeling about the labor market. Definitely, we've seen a continued process of people being more pessimistic about the labor market. Not about a recession or something, but just a view view that this is a pretty low hire, low fire labor market, and maybe the views are not as strong as you would think just looking at the aggregate payroll and unemployment data.
You're well positioned to do whatever you need to do to help the economy, but can monetary policy really do a lot in these situations? What's the lag? Jay Powell was talking about it could be a year from now before it hits the economy, whatever you did.
Yeah, absolutely. So monetary policy, based on all the kind of historical evidence, takes about a year to have its full effect on the economy and even longer on inflation. So we always have to be forward-looking. We have to be thinking about where's the economy going to be rather than where it is today or where it's been in the past. So that means trying to think through where is inflation going to be later this year or next year. Where's the economy going to be? Now, I go back to kind of the analysis we've done. I do expect underlying inflation eventually later this year to start coming back down because the effects of the tariffs on inflation will start to wane. I do expect, a continuation of the kind of good, positive movement in underlying inflation. But we'll have to watch. Does that continue? And again, what happens in terms of the conflict and its effects on inflation?
We're worried about the Iran war. We're worried about tariffs. People are worried about AI. And you mentioned the consumer sentiment numbers. But the economy has been fairly resilient. Why?
Well, I think America has the best productivity, highest productivity in the world. It's got among the highest productivity growth. We are a remarkably resilient, innovative, dynamic economy, and I think new technology is making a big difference. Not just AI, but more broadly, we've seen productivity growth that's actually been above par for the past 6 years. So I think there are some fundamentals that are driving solid gains in productivity, in real incomes, and demand for demand to hire people. But there's these various cross currents you mentioned. So again, last year the surprise was the economy was so resilient despite the uncertainty, despite other factors like the tariffs. This year it's another test of that resilience. But investment in AI and data centers I think will continue to be strong this year. And for as long as the economy continues to grow, I think consumer spending will continue to be a very positive factor.
Well, along those lines, what's your read on average hourly earnings or wages or whatever measure you want to use? Average hourly earnings came down to 3.5%. What's the sweet spot? What's a level at which it won't be a concern?
Yeah, I think we're at that level. If you look at all the different indicators, and now we have some very good real-time indicators. We have the standard official statistics. I think pretty much all of them are telling us that compensation is continuing to grow. Real compensation is growing, and it's growing in a way that's consistent with productivity growth we're seeing. So to my mind, the labor market, and whether you look at the unemployment rate and you look at wage growth, these are not factors pushing up inflation at all. So I feel like we're at a good place for that, and I think that's consistent with what we're seeing in the labor market in general.
You've been traveling around the state of New York lately. What are you hearing from CEOs? For a long time, the story has been, we're just sitting there because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that story has changed a bit. When you think about how do you respond to uncertainty, the first thing you probably do is you pause any longer-term plans around hiring and investment and try to figure out what to do. I think a lot of CEOs have said, well, we're past that, so now we just have to navigate a world with higher uncertainty, make the decisions that make sense, make the investments that make sense, and you hear about that a lot with AI and investments in AI. So I think we're kind of in the second stage, you will, of responding to uncertainty. It's really about, well, okay, we need to make decisions. Let's move forward. And I think that's consistent with what we're seeing. We're seeing positive job growth. We're seeing an economy that continues to grow and invest.
Well, are people talking at all about cutting back?
Well, it's interesting on that. I mean, going to the AI-specific question, I think most of the conversation the CEOs, most of them are talking about, is really about making smart decisions, hiring people with AI skills, not hiring in areas that may be jobs we don't need because we could use AI. So there's a lot of, I think, thought going into that, but not in terms of, we need to cut back our labor force. Of course, you see this with the data, too. We're not seeing high levels at all of initial claims for unemployment or layoffs. So I think it's a low hire, low fire, and low unemployment economy. It's an unusual mix, but I think that's what we're still seeing even today.
The next FOMC meeting at the end of the month is Jay Powell's last as chair, maybe. What's your understanding as the vice chair of the Open Market Committee about what happens if Kevin Warsh is not confirmed by then?
Well, Chair Powell already spoke to that recently in terms of the Board of Governors. I'll speak to the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. I mean, every January we have a vote about selecting a chair and a vice chair, and that vote is in place for throughout the year. So there's no issue of continuity. There's no issue of anything. That's all in place. Typically, we have this vote in January for the chair of the FOMC, or if a new chair is confirmed by the Senate, then that person becomes the chair of the FOMC. But I would just highlight the most important thing here is that we're just focused on doing our work. There's no issue about continuity or things like that at the FOMC. We're just doing what we always do, which is digging into all the data, trying to do our very best to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.
So basically, if Warsh is not confirmed, you don't have to do anything. You just continue on.
Exactly. At the FOMC, just continue on.
Now, Kevin has come out and said that there's a lot of things he would like to change, and we won't go down the whole laundry list. But how effective do you think with this FOMC, with this board, can he be in affecting change in the short run? Are we looking at some sort of massive change in the way things are done, or is this going to be a process that takes place over years?
Well, at first, Kevin Warsh understands the Federal Reserve very well. He was a governor. I knew him then. I think he has a keen understanding of what our mission is and the importance of what we do. I can't speak for him, and I haven't, spoken to him lately. But I do expect that when he does get confirmed by the Senate, that he will share his views and perspectives as he thinks about, what he wants to accomplish as chair. And I've worked now with 4 different chairs and many governors and many presidents. And the most, I think the most common element of all this is when people come into the Federal Reserve, they understand the importance of the work we do, the importance of the mission to the American people, and that's exactly what I expect when Kevin Warsh rejoins, if you will, the Federal Reserve.
Now, one of the open questions is what happens to Chairman Powell when he's no longer chairman but still a governor. Would you like to see him stay on?
Well, that's a decision for Chair Powell, and I don't have any comment on that. I leave that to him.